So today I want to talk about something that most people are completely missing about what Iran just did. Everyone is watching the American response. Everyone is watching the timeline of how long it took Washington to react. Everyone is watching the diplomatic statements and the military positioning that followed, but almost nobody is asking the question that actually matters most to ordinary people right now. How was China already inside the outcome before the response even arrived? Because that is the real story. Iran did not simply provoke America today. Iran ran a test, a deliberate, carefully structured test of the global system. A test designed to answer one question. Is the world still operating on American rules, or has it moved far enough toward a parallel system that those rules can be bent without triggering the consequences they once guaranteed? And before America finished calculating its response, China had already positioned itself to benefit from either answer. Not because China is faster than America, but because China has spent 20 years building itself into a position where it does not need to react at all. It simply needs to already be there. Understanding how that happened and what it means for your job, your energy bill, your savings, your food prices, and your future is what this video is about. So today I want to walk you through exactly what Iran tested, why America reacted late, and how China was already inside the outcome before the dust settled, part by part, country by country. So let us begin. The first thing you need to understand, the foundation of everything else I'm going to tell you today, is what it actually means when a nation tests a system as opposed to simply challenging it. Challenging a system is direct. It is visible. It invites an immediate response and a clear outcome. When a nation challenges the global order openly, militarily, diplomatically, economically, the dominant power responds. The challenge either succeeds or fails, and the rules are either enforced or visibly broken. That is how confrontations worked for most of the past century. Testing a system is different. Testing is subtle. It is designed not to produce a decisive confrontation, but to generate information, to discover exactly where the system's boundaries are, how quickly it responds, what it prioritizes, and where its constraints prevent it from acting at full strength. A test is not a gamble on winning. It is an investment in knowledge that makes future moves more precise. Iran has become, over 4 decades of confrontation with the United States, one of the most sophisticated testers of systemic limits in the world. It knows from long experience that direct confrontation with American military power is not survivable. But it also knows from equal experience that the system America enforces has edges, delays, and constraints that can be probed without triggering the full weight of American response. The question is no longer whether Iran will continue testing the system. Iran will. The question is whether the system can be tested so precisely and so repeatedly and from so many directions simultaneously that its responses become predictable and its predictability becomes exploitable. That is the game being played right now. And China is not a spectator in that game. China is the nation that built the playing field. Let me walk you through every major actor in this situation. With that framework in mind, on the surface, Iran looks like a nation engaging in the same pattern of provocative behavior that has characterized its relationship with the West for 45 years. Missile tests, shipping harassment, proxy activities, nuclear program advancement. On the surface, today's move looks like more of the same, another entry in a long sequence of calculated provocations, but underneath that surface, what Iran executed today was qualitatively different from its historical pattern. It was not a provocation designed to extract concessions or signal displeasure. It was a systems test, a probe designed to measure 3 specific variables simultaneously. First, response time. How long does it take America to move from event to coherent response in the current domestic and geopolitical environment? The answer to that question tells Iran precisely how much operational space exists between an action and its consequences. Second, response calibration. Is America willing to accept costs to enforce the rules, or does it apply pressure that is strong enough to signal resolve, but carefully limited to avoid economic blowback at home? Third, allied coherence. Do America's partners in Europe and the Gulf respond with unified alignment, or do their individual economic interests create visible gaps in the coalition? Iran designed today's move to generate answers to all three questions simultaneously. And the answers it received were, from a purely strategic standpoint, informative. The response came later than it would have a decade ago. The calibration was careful, firm enough to communicate resolve, constrained enough to avoid escalation. The Allied response showed the predictable tensions between nations that share strategic interests with America but have deepening economic relationships with China. Iran currently exports an estimated 1.5 million barrels of oil per day outside the dollar system. That revenue stream did not pause during today's test. It continued flowing, which means the test was conducted from a position of economic sustainability rather than desperation. That is a fundamentally different strategic posture from the Iran of 2012, when sanctions had genuinely crippled the economy, and the pressure to negotiate was acute. For ordinary Iranian families, the economic pain of sanctions remains severe and real. But for the government, the test today was conducted from a stronger position than any similar test in the past decade. On the surface, America's response to Iran's test when it arrived was substantive. New designations, new pressure on financial channels, clear military signaling, coordinated communication with allies. The response demonstrated capability, it demonstrated resolve. It was not a non-response. But underneath that surface, the delay mattered. And understanding why the delay happened tells you more about the current state of American power than the content of the response itself. America is managing a set of simultaneous constraints that have no precedent in the post-Cold War era. $39 trillion in national debt creates a direct linkage between foreign policy decisions and domestic economic conditions. A linkage that previous generations of American decision-makers did not have to navigate at this scale. A response to Iran that triggers energy price increases lands on American households immediately, visibly, and politically. That is not an abstract consideration. It is a real constraint on response speed and response intensity. The second constraint is allied management. America's partners in Europe are in the middle of their own energy cost recovery from the Ukraine war shock. Coordinating a unified allied response requires consultations that take time. And in those consultations, the different economic exposures of different allies create genuine disagreements about how hard to push and how fast to move. That coordination process is legitimate and necessary, but it creates delay. The third constraint is domestic political bandwidth. Every major foreign policy decision in the current American environment must be navigated through a domestic political landscape that has become significantly more complicated. Building the internal consensus necessary for a coherent, sustained response to Iran takes longer than it did when the political center was wider. None of these constraints make America weak in any absolute sense. America remains, by every significant measure, the world's dominant power. But they make America's responses to fast-moving situations less immediate than they were. And that reduction in immediacy is precisely what Iran was testing for. For ordinary American families, the consequence is not visible today. It accumulates over time in the form of slightly higher energy price volatility, slightly less predictable supply chain stability, and a global environment that requires more active management than the unipolar years demanded. On the surface, China appears to be a distant observer in the Iran-America confrontation. It has made no statement about today's events. It has taken no visible diplomatic action. It has neither endorsed Iran's test nor condemned it. From the outside, China looks like a nation carefully staying out of someone else's conflict. But underneath that surface, China was already inside the outcome of today's events before they began. Because China spent the past 20 years building itself into exactly that position. The phrase that matters here is structural positioning. China did not react to today's test quickly because China does not need to react quickly. Reaction implies that you are responding to something you did not anticipate or did not previously control. China anticipated this. China has been building the infrastructure that makes Iran's strategic position sustainable. The yuan oil settlement system, the $400 billion comprehensive partnership, the diplomatic cover at the United Nations, the technology cooperation that reduces Iran's dependence on Western supply chains for years. Every element of that infrastructure was in place before today's test occurred, which means China benefits from both possible outcomes of Iran's test. If the test reveals that American response has genuinely slowed and Allied coherence has genuinely weakened, the alternative system China is building gains credibility with every nation that was watching. If the test triggers a sharp American response that damages Iran economically, China absorbs Iranian oil at a deeper discount, strengthens its leverage over a more dependent Iran, and presents itself to the watching world as the reliable partner that stayed while others pressured. China imports approximately 40% of its total energy, with Iranian oil comprising a critical and growing portion of that supply. Today's Iranian oil continued flowing to China in yuan outside dollar infrastructure. Beyond the reach of American sanctions, that continuity is itself a demonstration. It tells every energy exporting nation that has ever considered diversifying away from dollar settlement that the system for doing so is functional, tested, and operational. For ordinary Chinese families managing economic uncertainty at home, none of this strategic positioning is immediately felt. But for China's government, today was confirmation that 2 decades of patient infrastructure investment have produced exactly the strategic leverage they were designed to produce. On the surface, Europe stands as America's most important and most reliable alliance network. Decades of shared institutions, shared values, and shared security architecture make the transatlantic relationship the foundation of the American-led global order. So, when America responds to Iran, Europe is expected to align, but underneath that surface, the Allied response today illustrated the fractures that sustained economic pressure creates in even the strongest alliance structures. Europe is still managing the energy cost consequences of the Ukraine war. Household energy bills across Germany, France, and the United Kingdom rose by 40 to 60% in the period following that disruption. Governments fell, political movements shifted, the social contract between European governments and their citizens was strained in ways that had not fully healed. A new round of pressure on Iran that risks Gulf energy disruption and therefore another energy price spike lands on European governments that are already politically fragile. That fragility creates visible tensions in Allied coordination. Some European governments want to align fully with the American response. Others are calculating whether full alignment carries a domestic political cost they cannot absorb. That calculation produces the gaps in coalition coherence that Iran was specifically testing for, and that China's alternative system is specifically designed to widen over time. European businesses have also been quietly building the kind of economic relationships with non-Western partners that create their own inertia against full sanctions alignment. Not because European governments are disloyal to the alliance, but because 20 years of Chinese economic engagement has created business communities with material interest in maintaining those relationships. For ordinary European families, the direct consequence of today is not yet visible. But it's the pattern of Iran testing, America responding late, and Allied coordination showing visible strain continues. The consequence will eventually arrive, as it always does for European households, through energy bills, through food prices, and through the economic growth slowdown that follows sustained geopolitical uncertainty in the regions that supply their energy. On the surface, The nations of the global south, across Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Central Asia, are the least powerful actors in the confrontation between America and Iran. They do not have the military capability, the economic scale, or the diplomatic weight to shape the outcome of what is happening between the major powers. But underneath that surface, the governments of the global south are making decisions right now that will determine the shape of the global order for the next generation. Because they are collectively deciding which system to build their futures into. The average nation in sub-Saharan Africa spends a significant portion of its foreign exchange reserves on energy imports. The average nation in Southeast Asia depends on Gulf energy to power the manufacturing base that employs its workforce. The average nation in Latin America conducts the majority of its international trade through dollar-denominated financial infrastructure. These are not neutral positions. These are dependencies, and dependencies create vulnerability to exactly the kind of pressure and counterpressure that today's events represent. What those governments are watching as they observe Iran test the system and America react late and China position itself inside the outcome is a practical question. Which system offers them better terms? The American-led system has provided stability, access to global capital markets, and institutional frameworks that have real value, but it also carries the risk of sanctions exposure, dollar volatility, and conditions attached to financial access that can be politically painful. The Chinese-led alternative offers different terms: infrastructure financing without political conditions, energy trade outside dollar dependency, a development model that does not require the same institutional reforms Western lenders demand. It carries its own risks, including debt, dependency, and reduced transparency. But for governments that feel constrained by the existing system, the existence of a credible alternative is itself valuable. Today's events made that alternative look slightly more credible. That incremental shift multiplied across dozens of governments making infrastructure decisions simultaneously is how systemic change actually happens. So now let us zoom out and look at the biggest picture of all. Because when you place Iran's test, America's delayed response, China's structural prepositioning, Europe's alliance strain, and the global South's quiet decision-making all on the same map, and you see something that goes far beyond one day's events. You see a system being tested to its limits, not in a single dramatic confrontation, but in an accumulating series of probes, each one generating information that makes the next one more precise. Iran is not trying to defeat the American-led system in a decisive battle. Iran is trying to map its exact boundaries, its exact delays, its exact constraints with the precision that comes from repeated, careful, survivable testing. And China is not trying to replace the American-led system in a single move. China is trying to build a parallel system that is functional enough, credible enough, and large enough that a critical mass of nations chooses to route significant portions of their economic activity through it. Not all of their activity, not necessarily most of it, but enough that American pressure loses the comprehensive reach that makes it most effective. And here is the crucial insight that most people are completely missing. These two strategies, Iran's testing and China's building, are not independent. They are complementary. Every successful test Iran conducts provides China's alternative system with a proof of concept. Every barrel of Iranian oil that flows to China in yuan, despite American sanctions, demonstrates to every watching nation that the alternative system is operational. Every day, America's response is delayed or calibrated below maximum strength, tells every potential alternative system participant that the cost of participation is lower than it once appeared. The result is a feedback loop that does not require coordination, though some coordination clearly exists because the interests of Iran and China are structurally aligned. Iran needs the alternative system to survive. China needs participants in the alternative system to make it viable. Iran's tests produce the demonstrations that attract participants. China's system provides the infrastructure that makes the demonstrations survivable for ordinary families everywhere. In America, in Europe, in Asia, in the global south, this feedback loop has concrete consequences. It means energy price volatility that is structurally higher than the unipolar years. It means supply chain complexity that requires more hedging and more redundancy. It means a geopolitical background noise that was simply absent from the confident decades of the 1990s and 2000s. The transition from a unipolar world to a more contested one is not a future event. It is the present reality. Today's events were another chapter in it. I want to end with the most surprising conclusion of this entire analysis. You might expect me to say that the story of today is about American decline. America reacted late. Its allies showed fractures. Its constraints were visible. The alternative system continued functioning without interruption. The narrative almost writes itself. America's losing, the alternative system is winning, and the era of American dominance is ending. But actually, no. The most important story coming out of today is not about decline at all. It is about the extraordinary difficulty of what China is actually attempting, and the very real possibility that the alternative system's greatest vulnerability is not American pressure, but its own internal contradictions. Consider what China's strategy actually requires to succeed. It requires Iran to remain a reliable energy supplier and a controlled testing partner rather than escalating into a conflict that disrupts the very energy supply China depends on. It requires Russia to remain a cooperative partner rather than a destabilizing force that damages the credibility of the non-Western system. It requires the global South to choose the alternative system's terms over Western terms, without the alternative system developing the same reputational problems that Western institutions have. And it requires the UN to develop sufficient global credibility that energy exporters are willing to hold it as a reserve currency rather than immediately converting it to dollars. Every one of those requirements is genuinely difficult. Iran is not a predictable or easily controlled partner. Russia's behavior has been deeply destabilizing to global stability in ways that complicate China's narrative of offering a better alternative. Several Belt and Road recipient nations have developed serious debt sustainability problems that have damaged China's reputation as a development partner, and the yuan remains far from a true reserve currency. Its share of global foreign exchange reserves is a fraction of the dollar's. The alternative system is real, it is growing, and today's events advanced it. But it is also fragile in ways that its most enthusiastic advocates underestimate. China is not building from a position of unchallenged strength. It is building while managing significant internal economic pressures, a complex set of international relationships, and a strategy that depends on partners. Iran, Russia, the global South, whose behavior China can influence but not control. That is the paradox at the heart of this moment. The alternative system's greatest test is not American pressure, it is its own coherence. So let us just recap what we covered today. Iran tested the system not with a provocation designed to extract concessions, but with a precisely architected probe designed to measure response time and response calibration and allied coherence simultaneously. The test was conducted from a position of economic sustainability made possible by the Chinese energy lifeline. America reacted late, not because of incapacity, but because $39 trillion in debt, European alliance fragility, and domestic political complexity have created real constraints on response speed and intensity that Iran has learned to map and exploit. China was already inside the outcome because 20 years of infrastructure building have positioned China to benefit from either result of Iran's test. The yuan oil settlement continued without interruption. The alternative system demonstrated its operational resilience. Every watching nation received another data point about the system's viability. Europe showed the alliance strain that sustained economic pressure creates governments caught between strategic alignment with America and the domestic political cost of energy price exposure that full alignment could trigger. The Global South is making infrastructure decisions right now, quietly choosing which systems to build their futures into based on exactly the kind of practical demonstration that today's events provided. And the surprise conclusion. The alternative system's greatest vulnerability is not American pressure, but its own internal contradictions, the difficulty of maintaining coherent, reliable partnerships with Iran, Russia, and the Global South simultaneously while building the financial credibility that a true reserve currency requires. Iran tested, America reacted late. China was already there. The transition from a unipolar world to a more contested one advanced another step. The feedback loop between Iran's testing and China's building continued turning. And for ordinary families everywhere, the background level of geopolitical complexity that governs their energy costs, their food prices, and their economic security rose imperceptibly as it has been rising steadily for years. Subscribe for more analysis of the forces reshaping global power, explained in simple English, and tell me in the comments, do you think China's alternative system is strong enough to survive its own internal contradictions, or will those contradictions ultimately limit how far it can go? I will see you next time.